So, Aaron, your wife will miss the first part, so that's okay. All right. So let me share this. I do want to just do a quick review. I found that doing some review is good. So we'll just race through that. Um, and let's get rid of these controls. There we go. So don't forget, obviously, I like questions. We've got one. I got one card here. So I want you to definitely bring those, especially as we go on. We'll have more time to, to delve into tangents and other things. You will receive. Oh, maybe I should do this so I don't forget at the end. Let me before I do the review. So you will receive tomorrow in the email a link to the recording to this class. Kathleen will send that out to you, but also a revised schedule because we've got Thanksgiving week coming up, not next week, but I think the week after that, maybe, or maybe the week after that. I can't remember. It's going too fast, but we won't meet on that Wednesday of Thanksgiving for obvious reasons. But that puts us a little behind, I don't want to get too close to Christmas because there's really 8 sessions. So I think I want to propose trying a Monday and Wednesday, just 1 week, doing 2. I don't know. I know it's intense. That's a lot. But anyway, and if we can get enough of you to be there and be able to do that, and we can talk next week about whether we can pull that off. So you'll get the schedule. It's basically Wednesdays. Um, but I just wanted to see if we could throw a Monday in there and that way we'll be, because I think it makes sense to finish a couple weeks before Christmas and then we can go from there. So you'll get that revised schedule. So anyway, okay, so we know what the gospel is. The event of Jesus told, well, we should say it together. The event of Jesus told with its significance. So the history, the event, the story of Jesus with its significance. And we talked about all of these wonderful words. Righteous, made innocent, Jill, made perfect, made like it's interesting because this word is kind of has a setting in court, kind of courtroom type of thing. It's, so, you know, the jury comes in and says innocent, not guilty, not because of what we've done, but because of what Christ's done, because of our faith in him. So his righteousness becomes ours. So we'll keep talking about justification and righteousness and all of that. But all these things we talked about, so those are cool. And then last week we talked about the word, and I said that the word is first Jesus, then the message about Jesus, and then the canonical scriptures. And if you didn't get a chance to watch the video that was sent out today, no problem. I didn't expect that you'd get it to see it before this class, but I did do a video on the reliability of the New Testament. And that link was sent out to you. So if that does, you got it?
Yeah,
it was good. Some of you
watched it, yeah.
Yeah, cool. It's just kind of a fun. I'm kind of a geek when it comes to ancient biblical manuscripts. I just love getting into that. One of the highlights on my was it my first sabbatical was I got to spend like 3 days in Dublin, Ireland, and I didn't know that this museum was there. Well, yeah, I guess I didn't know it was there. And my wife is just incredible. She gets all the tour books out, and she's got it all, and we headed out to a castle or something outside of Dublin, it was cool, little half-day trip or something. And I'm just watching her turn the pages and I see the Chester Beatty Museum. And I'm like, oh my gosh, I can't believe we're here. Stop the bus, let us off. Anyway, but in this museum in Dublin is the oldest papyrus manuscripts of the New Testament. You've got all the Gospels and the letters of Paul that date to 250 AD. Ooh. Now we have that little fragment that I mentioned in the video that goes back to maybe 125 AD, but this is all the leaflets of a codex of the Bible. It's on one column, and it's in the Chester Beatty Museum. It's Papyrus 45, 46, so whatever. So I got to see it in person. It's like right there. And they had on display Philippians 2, the Christ hymn, that says Christ having equality with God didn't count equality as something to be grasped, but emptied himself. And so I had my girls that, they're like, okay, we're here, Dad. I'm like in tears. Anyway, so because the cool thing is that hymn is likely one of the most ancient creeds of the Christian faith, can go right back to the very beginning, that Paul probably brings into his letter. So I said to my family, I said, you're looking at the oldest piece of scripture in existence, and probably looking also at the oldest Christian hymn in existence. Anyway, it's cool. So yes, there you can see I'm kind of a geek on this stuff. But yeah, so if you didn't get a chance to watch the video, it's a good little supplement when it comes to our witness to the gospel, to the story about Jesus. I think are very dependable. So canonical scriptures. If you ever want, I don't recommend this person for everything at all, but he does have some really cool infographics like this. This is a nice description of different translations of the Bible. And if you want this, I can send it to you, or you just go to Wesley Huff. This is the guy. He's a Apologetics Canada, and he does have some good stuff. But like I say, I don't agree with everything at all that he says. But nonetheless, he's got some interest. He's done really good with this. So when you think about English translations, there's quite a few of them, aren't there? That's a lot. But the one thing people always ask me about this, so I wanted to just front load it and tell you that you've got paraphrases, dynamic equivalent, so it's more thought for thought, and then word for word translations. We use the New Revised Standard Version on Sunday mornings. My favorite is the ESV for the most part, although there's parts of the NRSV I really like. The most widely sold and used translation ever in the history of English translations, including the King James Bible, is the NIV. Sold more copies than even the King James Version over here, or what's called the New King James Version, where they've updated the language, which I certainly encourage you, if you love the King James, to use this. Some of the English words you don't mean the same thing that they meant back in the King James Version. So anyway, and then you probably have heard about The Message by Eugene Peterson. That's a paraphrase. In other words, he's trying to tell you what it means. He's not worried about translating word for word. And sometimes that can be a more accurate translation, because doing it word for word, maybe we miss an idiom, or so I like to have all of these. For my study, I use this one, and then I pull out The Message, and I almost look at these as almost a commentary. But anyway, so just know that when it comes to your English translation of the Bible, this is a lovely little chart to kind of help you see where it falls. I've showed this to some pastors, and they say, oh, the NIV should be more over here, So, this is his sense of it. When the NIV first came out, the King James folks, ooh, bad. The NIV is bad, because the King James Version, they believe, was divinely inspired, like not just the originals that it was translated from, but the book. And it's good. I won't go into the weeds with it, because we have a lot of these other ones are based on newer manuscripts that have been found in the last couple hundred years. And so, whereas the King James, they used the best manuscripts available back in the 1600s. So, but nonetheless, it's complicated, but this is a nice little chart to help you see, okay, what kind of Bible, because I get asked all the time, what translation should I use? Well, I'd encourage you to get, one one of these, or the NIV is great. And then, so having one of these is kind of cool. The one I had when I was a kid was Good News for Modern Man or something it was called, but anyway, but
would the timeline look something like that as well? I mean,
not necessarily. So like the message is, I don't know, how old is the message? 15 years old, maybe 20 years. It's not that old. Is that what you mean as far as timeline?
well, I mean, if King James is probably older, then I'm wondering if the paraphrases are more recent.
Absolutely. So the oldest of these is the King James. The new King James was done just, I don't know, 15 years ago or 20 years ago. I don't know exactly. But most of these listed are more current, more newer. And all of these, the NIV came out back in the 70s, I think. Yeah. And the ESV is fairly new. The New Revised Standard Version, there's some that he doesn't even have here, like the Revised Standard Version that I studied with is actually similar to this ESV now. So
I don't see the Berean either, which I tend to really like.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, I wonder where that one would fall. I've heard of that, yeah, but I haven't used it before. So yeah.
I think it's
In
a
our
word for
Bible
word.
study, our group,
Yeah,
everybody has a different translation.
yeah,
And we've found that we have to not try to read along, just listen
yeah.
when the person reads.
Yeah, right.
Because they're so
Sometimes
different.
they are very different. Sometimes I had my Bible software have a tool that will put them right next to each other, and it even tells me this one's 70%, 10% different than this one. The whole bit. I actually like reading along when in a different translation. Sometimes I have on our Wednesday Bible studies, there's a person that loves the King James, so and I think he loves the challenge of reading all the these and thous and everything. But I like to listen to him read it and watch along, because I find that it's like, okay, yeah, word orders, different changes, but yeah. Anyway, okay, so we'll keep rolling. So remember last week we talked about how God speaks and creates a relationship, and we talk about that as law and gospel. Let me put this back up here. Um, so and distinguishing law and gospel is really important. And this is a fun Lutheran theologian that I really like. And he says this about the law. He says, the law tells us that we owe God fear, love, and trust. Moreover, we owe all three to God at the same time. Further yet, we owe love to friends and enemies alike. That's what Jesus said, right? Love your enemy. You've heard it said, love your neighbor, but I say, love your enemy. Wow. How are you doing with this owing? The law is right, and you must agree with it, but the law has a severe limit. It cannot give you what it demands from you. I think that's really powerful. It describes but does not provide. It demands but not give. Does not give. That's why we need the gospel. Those of you who love to read theology, this book that I'm quoting from here, Armchair Luther for Armchair Theologians by Stephen Paulson, is a really good primer in Lutheran theology, I guess you could say. All right, so that's law. And then we looked at the gospel, as we've already talked about. The gospel is that what God has done, God reconciled us to himself in Christ Jesus, and that rushes in, right? If you have law and no gospel, you're in trouble. And so I just made the point last week that I think that is a distinctive, in a lot of churches, you get a lot of law. You should. And sometimes it's a more liberal progressive law, and sometimes it's a more conservative traditional kind of law, standards, morals, etc. But it's still law. So here you'll hear the law preached, because the law does set boundaries and give us direction, but ultimately the law will always accuse us at the end of the day. And that's why then every Sunday you're going to hear the gospel in the liturgy, in the sermon. We start every Sunday with an absolution. we've all fallen short of the glory of God, and we start right off, and, you know, that's probably, if you think about it, the most best time of your week, because for that moment, all sin is wiped away.
And then the next moment.
And then the next moment, the next moment, it doesn't last long. Anyway, all right, so that's a good review. The one little point I didn't make last week that I want to reiterate is sometimes people make the understandable mistake and think Old Testament's law, New Testament is gospel. It'd be an understandable, deal but there's gospel in the Old Testament, tons of it in the Hebrew scriptures. The word chesed in Hebrew is loving kindness, steadfast love, faithfulness, covenantal love. We'd have to have a paragraph to translate it in English, and it's just one word in Hebrew. And God is full of mercy and grace, and we hear this all the time. Now, I'm not saying there isn't plenty of law that accuses in the Hebrew scriptures, but also in the New Testament, there's law and gospel. I think I mentioned, like, Jesus's words, you must be perfect like your Father in heaven, in the Sermon on the Mount. How are you doing with that owing? So that's kind of law. But then one person said, Jesus preaches the law, but he is the gospel. And I like that, because, when you start hearing one of his parables, more than likely you're in trouble. Because a lot of law there, but nonetheless, we love that distinction, and we really believe that that's an important. It's not just glasses that we give you to look at scripture with, although it is, but we believe that it's there in the text. It's like, this is the way God's word comes to us in these two words, and if you only know one of the words, it doesn't quite work. So we know the law shows us the boundary. It convicts and exposes our sin and distrust, like it did for Adam and Eve. And we won't worry about the third use for now. So we're not just sin, and the law doesn't just say we're sinners, but also we're presumptuous saints. I'm just following. Well, not really. You need a savior. Okay, so yeah, we'll do this. This is fun. This is good. Some more ways to think about law and gospel. The law says do, the gospel says done. Law's command, gospel's a promise. When you're hearing a promise, you're hearing gospel. When you hear a command, you're hearing the law. The law oftentimes comes in that imperative mood with, where in English, we put an exclamation mark. In Greek, each word, you can have a verb be in the imperative, but you don't put an exclamation mark. Indicative mood is for a verb to review your English, is it's done. It's an accomplished action. It's something that, so oftentimes the gospel, when you hear those verbs and indicative, you're hearing the gospel. The law, this is a really good way to think about law. We are the subject of the verbs. Do this, worship. Don't neglect to worship. Do this, do that. Love your neighbor. God is usually the subject of the verbs in the gospel. This is what God has done for you. So you're the object of the action. So we've got that, but the gospel recreates the trust, even while we see we've distrusted. The law kills, the gospel gives life and makes righteous. So I like this little summary of law gospel. Okay, it's good for us to do this because this is a great Lutheran distinctive, but now we can start thinking about the life of Martin Luther and then some Lutheran theology. Okay, but questions with the law gospel thing or comments? Let me get our folks at home back up on the screen here so I can see them. Yeah, there we go. Put them in front of Martin Luther. Okay, all right, so not hearing questions. This is a great summary. Now the soul no longer seeks to be righteous in and of itself, but it has Christ as its righteousness, and therefore seeks only the welfare of others. Another way to put it, and I think Luther said this, is God doesn't need your good works. God doesn't need your good works. Your neighbor needs your good works. You know, when it comes to God, you have Christ, you can't get any more perfect with that, but certainly your neighbor does. Might be pushing it too far, but anyway, that's a good summary. All right, well, let's talk about Luther's life. But before we do that, I think what I want to do is tell you why in this class I'm spending half a session talking about a guy that lived 500 years ago. In my faith journey, I grew up Lutheran, as you've heard, and then I kind of took a pretty good chapter in the kind of expression of Christianity that was, I would say, in retrospect, very law focused. You're not going to be a lukewarm Christian. You're going to be on fire for Christ, and I was all in. I still love Jesus. I love Jesus, and I wanted to give him my all. And so, I just went all in. The leader of this, it wasn't a church necessarily, but he was a really great Christian musician who was in the forefront of the kind of contemporary Christian genre. I don't know if some of you have probably heard of him, Keith Green. I don't know if you've ever heard of Keith Green, but he was a tremendously dynamic preacher and played the piano like nobody's business and sang these great songs. And he just kind of captured my heart. And man, I was all in. And he was like, you're, none of this lukewarm Christian stuff. You're going to go. And my wife to be, Sandy, before we were married, while we were in college, called me at this stage a super Christian because I was going to be a super Christian. But not in a bad. She wasn't like belittling me, but she's like, she stuck with the Lutheran stuff a little better than I did at the time. So, but bottom line, the reason I tell you all that is to say I burn out. I just could never do enough. This person just is always hitting me with law. The law says do this, and it's never done. And grace says believe this, and everything is done already. That's another quote from Luther. So I really burn out. And I was like, I can't do this. And but I went back and I started reading some of Luther. And because I grew up Lutheran, I never read Martin Luther, and most Lutherans have never read Martin Luther, and I just rediscovered the gospel, and this law gospel thing really saved me. So that's why I love Martin Luther. I grew up as a Lutheran, but I think his story is tremendously resonating with me and helpful. But right out of the gate, let me say this. We do not worship Martin Luther. Martin Luther would be very upset with us that we have Lutheran in our name. He would never have wanted that. And originally, Lutherans were known as evangelicals. And, but we were given that name as a cut down, and evidently people said, yeah, okay, we'll take it. We'll claim it. We're Lutheran, so, so anyway, I want to say that at the beginning. Martin Luther was a sainted sinner, just like the rest of us. Maybe I should tell you before we start. Yeah, I usually wait to the end, but I'll tell you this now. The dean of my seminary, so to be a Lutheran pastor, you 4-year degree in college, and then another 4 years for your master's in divinity. And one of those years is an internship, but nonetheless, so 3 years of academic work. And my dean of my seminary told the story of his confirmation pastor, and confirmation back then took place in 7th and 8th grade. And he said that this old Lutheran pastor, gave a harder test than anything he ever had in graduate school. But the last question was, what is your religion? was the last question on, that was back when you, to get confirmed, you had to take a test. Well, guess what? You don't have to take a test. Woo! Or maybe I'll put this as the only question. What is your religion?
I know your answer.
Okay, so you can't say. That's right. So, and he said everybody got it wrong, because what do you think they put?
Lutheran.
Lutheran. And the pastor said, that is not your religion, you are a Christian. And so Lutheran is an adjective. One of the things Lutherans love is music. So anyway, I can't wait to talk more about music, by the way, with what you guys talked about, but we'll say that when we get to worship. So let's go over this guy's life. I can say that, let's see, I want to try and do this in about 15 minutes, because then we want to talk about Lutheran theology, maybe 20. All right, so I'm keep my eye on the thing. So the beginnings. So we're talking about the end of the 1400s and then into the 1500s. I think Luther passes away in 1546, something like that. 1517 is the big year where everything got started. But Luther was born in the 1400s, end of the 1400s. He lived to 60 something. So in the beginning, he was born into a German family, although there wasn't a country of Germany as such. This is part of what was called the Holy Roman Empire, which wasn't holy or Roman, but nonetheless. But in the area that we would know today as Germany, and his father owned not the land, because that would be something only the nobles would have, but he owned mining equipment, and he had a business, a mining business. So he would lease the land and mine it for copper, and was doing pretty well. This is the feudal system, but there was kind of a little bit of a middle class starting with some of the artisans and his dad was a copper miner. And one of the things you need if you have a business, what do you need? There's a lot of legal stuff, right? So you need a lawyer. And Luther was way ahead of his class. He was incredibly bright, and he was destined for law school. And his dad's like, this boy is going to be my family attorney. So he sent Luther to law school and spent tons of money for all the law books. You had to buy them. So Luther grows up in a very typical kind of German family, and later he'll feel like his mom and dad were good parents, but his dad was, the part of this culture is pretty, strict, I guess you could say, from today's standards. And so he goes to law school, but it's not working. And again, this is broad brushstrokes. I'll recommend some great books for you in a minute. But he's on travels, and he gets caught in the worst thunderstorm you can imagine. Have you ever been in a horrible, horrible thunderstorm and been out in the wild, so to speak? I can remember in the eastern Arizona White Mountains when I was a kid, we got caught in a thunderstorm where there was like lightning, boom, lightning, boom, lightning. There was no 1001, 1002, there was it was lightning and the thunder, just boom, boom. I mean, I really can remember running for my life. I probably shouldn't have been running, but we were running, and I can remember diving onto the porch of the cabin that we were at. But nonetheless, that scared the jeebers out of me. Well, Luther had this kind of horrible, amazing experience. And so back in that day, you had different saints you would pray to or through. And so he prayed to, I think it was St. Anne, that to be saved. And if he was saved, he promised that he would become a monk. Well, he was saved. And when he gets back, he decides to become a monk. How do you think Dad felt about that? He'd made all this investment in the law books. and all this, and now his son is gonna become a monk. Later, Luther will say, this is way later, he said to his dad, "Dad, I broke the commandment about honoring your father and mother." Even though he became a priest. And from our perspective, God used him to do an amazing thing. He says, "Dad, I did not honor you. I did not," so that's an interesting reflection, isn't it? Nonetheless, Luther becomes a monk. His dad comes to his ordination and he's so nervous. Evidently, he actually spilt the wine. He was shaking. So and the only reason I say that is that Luther, what we know about his personality is he was all in, and he was tremendously devoted, tremendously bright, and he quickly rises up in notoriety in his Augustan order, is the branch of is the order that he got ordained in. And so he becomes a monk, and he becomes very adept at, and so much so that the head of his order, his name is Staupitz, sends him to Rome to resolve some kind of conflict that the Augustinians were having. And when you went to Rome, you did a pilgrimage. So you didn't get on a horse and buggy, you walked from Germany to Rome. So he did that. He did the pilgrimage. And he got there and he was very disillusioned. And this isn't anything that Roman Catholics today and scholars and wouldn't agree with it. There was all kinds of corruption and there were all kinds of stuff, and it really disillusioned him about things. And that was an important event in his life. It was kind of like, Stephanie, when you went to that Lutheran church and they were so mean, these things leave impressions on you. And he was seeing the people buying and selling, like getting indulgences, which we'll talk about here in a minute. And the folks, anyway, what he saw there was not good, and it really shaped him. He went back, and his mentor again, Staupitz, sees he's incredibly bright and talented, so he sends him to get his doctorate in the scriptures, and this is huge. And so Luther gets his doctorate in the scriptures, which means he's studying Greek and Hebrew, and he already knew Latin, he already knew German, and so he was very good with languages. And so he gets his doctorate in scriptures. Well, lo and behold, something else was going on about this time. And that is the refurbishing and kind of creation of St. Peter's Basilica. That today, if you went, have any of you been to St. Peter's? Jill, you have? Yeah. And Tika?
I want to go back so bad.
Yeah. Marissa, I know you would love it someday. And it's just mind-boggling, you can go into St. Peter's and you can see they actually have a line where the different cathedrals throughout the world stop, and St. Peter's keeps going. And of course, who was the big artist? Michelangelo. Absolutely. And he was not cheap. And you've got the Sistine Chapel there too, which you definitely want to see someday in person. Well, that was very expensive. And so the Pope Leo X, had to borrow tons of money to get this done. And so how do you raise money to pay for St. Peter's Cathedral, which we're honoring St. Peter in Christ our Lord? And well, one of the practices of the church, and it still is in existence, but today to some degree, but not like it was back then. So have you heard about indulgences? Jill, you've heard about it. You guys know what we're talking a little bit about, Stephanie?
Pay to play.
So I got thumbs up there on the other side. So, yeah, I want to put it in the best light possible, that you, as penance for sin, you would give an offering, and and it was supposed to accompany contrition, like you're really sorry for your sin, and so you're going to give this money, and you get a piece of paper which is kind of reducing your time in purgatory. Because the thought was that, well, very few of us have enough righteousness this side of heaven to go straight to heaven. And so one might go to purgatory and, get more merits, and then you would get to heaven. I hope I'm giving that justice. So, and those of you who have Roman Catholic background, if you please help me here if I get this wrong. But nonetheless, but in Luther's day, you could not only do that for yourself, but for someone that's already died. So, long story short, a guy named Tetzel is employed by the Pope to do an indulgence. And so what this would happen is it was officially sanctioned, and then bishops in the different areas would say, yes, we can do it. And so here comes this indulgence seller, and the way it went, again, this is the way it went back then, is they kind of scare you, like your poor loved ones in purgatory, suffering and anguish, and and this phrase worked in German, it works in English. Every time a coin in the coffer rings, a soul from purgatory springs. And this was the kind of language that was said. Luther says this in the 95 Theses, that this is the way it was being done. Well, Luther now has gone to get his doctorate, and he's starting to read the New Testament. And so in the little thing here, his crisis of faith breakthrough and the Wittenberg door, he has read Romans 3:21, which we've already heard in this class, where we're told that we are justified, made righteous by faith, not by works, apart from the works of the law. And yet here, this practice of purgatory, it's like, wait, we got to go and get some more works to get, into actual heaven. And then you can't buy forgiveness. This is the way it looked to him. Again, I think you could give indulgences a little bit more kind treatment than that, but that's the way it was. And so he saw all these poor people from his land going off, giving their hard-earned money to pay for St. Peter's Cathedral, because if I didn't make that connection, this is the way money was being raised to pay for St. Peter's. And then, of course, there were deals like the one archbishop that was part of overseeing Luther's area. People had to travel a little bit to where these were being sold. Got some, I'll scratch your back, you scratch mine with the Pope, and getting another bishop. There were all kinds of deals going on. And so, oh my goodness, so Luther's like, no, this is wrong, we can't do this. And he's also had this kind of breakthrough because he always was trying to please God and he could never do it. And he just had this horrible introspective conscience. And when he finally read in Paul, he had this breakthrough. And so what he does, he writes the 95 Theses that criticize indulgences, and he puts it on the Wittenberg door. And this is what he describes his tower experience. And so I'll just read this real quick. And this is the meaning. The righteousness of God is revealed by the gospel, namely the passive righteousness with which merciful God justifies us by faith, as it is written, he who through faith is righteous shall live. Here I felt that I was altogether born again and had entered paradise itself through open gates. There, a totally other face of the entire scripture showed itself to me. See, what he had before that was law. And now he sees the gospel. And I extolled my sweetest word with a love as sweet as the hatred with which I had before hated the word righteousness of God. Why did he hate righteousness? Because he could never measure up. Could never measure it. Thus, that place in Paul was for me truly the gate to paradise. So this is what Luther writes many years after about that experience. So he puts these indulgences on the Wittenberg door, and some people debate that today, but regardless, the printing press had just been invented, 40 years before? Who's the guy? Gutenberg? Yeah. And so the printers this is kind of a little known fact, but a really fun fact. The cash cow of the printers, like this is what made money. What do you think it was? Indulgences.
Mm.
Because people, you know, they would print these beautiful pieces of paper, these indulgences, and people would pay. And then the church would hand these out and people kept these. They were like, this is my, this is. And you know, for us modern folks, we go, that's kind of silly, but they believe that. They believe that the Pope had that power, you know? So, oh my goodness. So now Luther comes along and starts to criticize indulgences. That's like getting to people's pocketbooks, isn't it? So, but the irony is that shortly after Luther and indulgences just fell out to nothing, guess what took its place? Luther. Luther never made one penny on anything he ever wrote, but the printing presses went crazy. You know, we call it going viral today, you know, on the internet. Well, everything Luther wrote, they would print it and it sold out. It went all over Europe, all over Scandinavia, the northern, his writings in a matter of 5 years were all over the known world. And so, you know, a fire started. Now, here's something I want to tell you that Luther never, ever, ever, and this is something in my Catholic brothers and sisters, sometimes when I watch YouTube videos, I don't think quite say it accurately. They say that Luther split the church, or he left the church and he, you know, he wanted to start. This is one thing I hear a lot, which is completely not true. He wanted to start a new church. Luther never wanted to start a new church. He wanted to reform certain practices. In particular, at the beginning, was the practice of indulgences. And he really believed that he could get together, let's have a conversation and get together with the cardinals. And you know, this is wrong. Look, it says this in the Bible, it says this in scripture. And he really believed that, you know, the church would come around and we'd have this conversation and the Pope would realize, oh yeah, we shouldn't do this, you know. Well, however, the response from Rome was different. Rome's response was, you're challenging the Pope. Because the Pope said it's good, so it's good. You know, you're challenging things set down that are in tradition, and the ecclesiastical authorities have, you know, approved. Who are you? You're just a backwater German monk, you know. So the church's response was just to shut him up. And they tried through Staupitz, his mentor in the Augustinian order. Staupitz was very sympathetic to Luther, but, you know, and then they sent a cardinal and they sent, I won't go into the weeds on everything, just to get him. Luther thought, oh, I'm going to get a conversation. And it was, stop doing what you're doing. Okay, well, again, to make a very long story short, now we go a few years, and in that day they had these what were called diets, but not like diets like I need, but they had, it's a convention. So there you might hear about the Diet of Worms or the Diet of Augsburg or the Diet of Speyer. The Diet of Speyer, by the way, is when those princes who were protesting, who joined with the Lutheran movement, or the were called protesters, Protestants. That's where that word comes from. But nonetheless, there was a famous Diet of Worms, because it was in the city of Worms, down south. And Luther was called there and promised safe conduct. And the only thing about that is the guy named John Huss, who lived about 100 years before Luther, was promised safe conduct. And he ended up on the stake. But anyway, Luther, now I got to tell you about Luther's protector. And it's this guy. His name is Frederick. And I can see I'm end of my 20 minutes. So, okay, I got to really roll. Frederick was an elector. In the Holy Roman Empire, you had like 8 or 9 electors who were the dukes or the princes or whatever of certain areas of the Holy Roman Empire. And they elected the emperor. So it's like the electoral college, but it's just 9 guys, so they decide. So he was very powerful, but yet not more powerful than the emperor, but he was powerful. Well, he liked Luther. He was a devout Roman Catholic. He had the largest collection of relics. Relics were these things like a piece of the Holy Cross, or the bones of, this person or that person, or a rose that this person touched and turned to gold, or whatever. And so he had this incredible collection with which people would pay to see, almost like an indulgence. Like, if I see this, I get, certain merits just by coming to see this. And Luther, totally went against that. But ironically, Prince Frederick had this huge collection, but Prince Frederick liked Luther. We don't even know that they ever met, like ever in person met, but Frederick defended Luther. One reason, selfishly, is Luther was a professor at his prestigious university in Wittenberg. And everybody was coming now from all over the world to go to Wittenberg. Well, so he protects Luther. So he's got Luther protected. Luther goes off to Worms. This is the famous story where Luther basically gets there again, thinking we're going to have a debate, theological debate, and his writings are placed in front of him and said, "Do you recant?" And he started to try and no, we just want to know, yes or no. That's it. That's all you get to say, yes or no. And so Luther actually asked for time to think, and they come back the next day, and he's now had a really rough night, and he comes back the next day, and he says, "Look, some of this is devotional work, and I can't recant that. That's just, Christian, teaching. Some of what I've written, I've been too harsh," because he was the Pope went at him, and he went at the Pope, and this was not a day where you just had respectful dialogue. It got ugly. I'll just be honest with you. And so Luther admitted that some of us I spoke, too harshly, but bottom line, he says, "I cannot and I will not recant." Now, some people don't know for sure whether he said this, but the famous line is, "Here I stand." And at that point, he had condemned himself, because now he's a heretic. And so Luther has safe conduct to go back to Wittenberg, which is safe ground. He's not in safe ground now, but so he leaves that same day, I believe, and on his way, he gets kidnapped. But guess who kidnaps him? Frederick.
These conversations have been happening where? In
Worms.
In
So
Worms, okay.
that big moment was in Worms, yeah, in the town of Worms. But I mean, there's a lot has gone on until that point, but he's asked to recant. So he is swept. He's on his way back. Prince Frederick kidnaps him because he knows he's going to be killed if he isn't captured. Frederick hides him in a castle called Wartburg Castle. A lot of Lutheran universities are called Wartburg or whatever. And he has to be in exile for about 9 months. And guess what he does while he's there? He translates from a famous Catholic scholar, Erasmus, his Greek New Testament into German. But not just into German, because there really wasn't a German. There were all these different dialects, and they couldn't understand each other. Luther today, even though Germany is only like maybe 4% Christian people now, that's about all the people in Germany that's even claim to be Christian. They look at Luther as the one who created the language, because he took all these different dialects and he basically created the German language. Not only did he translate the Greek into German, but he kind of created the language. So he translates the New Testament while he's in exile, but finally he goes back because everything's going haywire. Now people are going way further than he did. They're burning, they're destroying statues and destroying stained glass windows, and it just getting out of hand. And Luther's like, "No, stop. I just want to reform these things," but it just, boom, it goes. Okay, well, I don't want to, I could go the rest, you can read more about it. A lot of things happen. another diet happens where now a lot of the princes that have gone with Luther, they get together and the Augsburg Confession is written. This is still the founding document. If you want to, what is Lutheran? Well, it's this statement of faith, the Augsburg Confession. We are not organized as far as structure, like Presbyterian Church is known for presbyters and this system of governance. The Catholic Church is, you got Pope and cardinals and bishops and, we Lutherans have never had a set way of governing ourselves. We're very eclectic that way. Sometimes we've had bishops, sometimes presidents, sometimes, what makes us a church is our confession of faith, not a system of organization. Like, for instance, the Episcopal Church, which is Episcopal means bishop. So that's what they're known for. We have this confession of faith in 1532, I think. I'm forgetting my years now, but where the Augsburg Confession was written, and what it was, the goal of it is to say, we are not heretics. This is the basic faith. There were Catholic bishops at the time who said, well, this is just the Christian faith. There wasn't anything radically, different. And so the reformers, were making that case. And that's called the Augsburg Confession. A few other things I should race through here and tell you that happened. So we got that, we got the Wartburg Castle. I don't have time to talk about the Peasants' War. It wasn't Luther's best day, but the peasants. So partly what he got started then went into what we call the temporal realm. And Luther was so critical of the princes. You guys are ruling poorly and horribly. Stop exploiting your subjects, and this type of thing. You're causing this revolt. But then to the peasants, he said, hey, you still have to respect them. It's the order of government, and you can't arm yourselves and, do this. So he was critical of both sides, and he got tangled up in the middle, and it was not good. It's not our best moment. Luther gets married to Catherine von Bora, and that's a picture of Catherine. Catherine was a nun. So what happened, because the movement kind of emptied the monasteries and the nunneries because they're like, oh, you mean we don't have to do this to be righteous before God? And so he wasn't good for the monasteries. Well, nuns oftentimes were there because their families couldn't afford to take care of them. And so a group of nuns escaped one of the nunneries by hiding themselves in herring barrels, and they arrive in Wittenberg. Well, what do the reformers have to do for these wonderful gals? They got to find them husbands, because otherwise, this is back in the day where they wasn't like they could go out and get a job and take care of themselves, and their families were going to. So Catherine was one of those nuns. And they tried to get her married to this other person, and she said, no, I'll only marry this guy and Luther. And so Luther and she got together, and it was the best thing that ever happened to Luther. Luther was given by Prince Frederick the Augustinian monastery in Wittenberg that's still there to this day. There's a museum in it now. And he was a horrible manager. And Catherine had gardens. She made wine and beer, and she got that place breaking. And maybe just a fun little side note, after Luther dies, and in that day, women could not inherit property. They couldn't inherit anything. Luther put her as the inheritor of everything, even though it was illegal. She didn't get it because it was illegal, but he did that. Now, I'm not saying Luther was some, modern day, liberated person, but his marriage to Catherine was like one of the best things. I love to hear their letters, to read their letters. Affectionate, humor, and she stood up to him. It's really a cool relationship. Luther also went around and he saw that the people knew nothing about the faith. And so he wrote two catechisms, a small catechism and a large catechism. And the small catechism is still used to this day in confirmation curriculums like ours. And if you were confirmed in the Lutheran Church, you would have, used that. He wrote that for parents to educate their kids. But nonetheless, he wanted Christians, this gets to the priesthood of all believers, because in his day, they were, here's a great stat. Before the Reformation, the literacy rate was around 10% in Germany, in that area. After 70. So, again, this is what modern day Germans would say, oh, that was what Luther did. That was good. The theological stuff they kind of dismissed. But so anyway, there we got the Augsburg Confession, his writing and preaching. Luther dies at a ripe old age of 60 something. And for that time, this is just a couple things to sum up. In centuries following, and this is from Jim Ness, again, one of my favorite Luther scholars. In the centuries following Luther's death, not everyone has agreed with the appraisals of Luther. Here, let me move this. You guys at home can see it probably, but I gotta move your picture. Appraisals of Luther's friends. Still a hugely controversial figure, Luther has generated libraries of scholarship both for and against. Sometimes the symbol is negative, Luther being regarded as the archetype of a broken church, unity, intolerance, and doctrinaire prejudice. I'm going to come back and let me just stop there. So sometimes when I tell the story of Luther, people say, oh, you just told us all the good stuff. Well, I've alluded to some bad stuff. One, Luther was a sinner, and we don't worship Luther, and he did some bad things, said some bad things. Early on in his ministry, because you've got a lot of anti-Semitism, even, at this time, and then obviously it kept going, still to this day. But Luther talked about how we should befriend our Jewish neighbors, and because he wanted to witness to them, he wanted them to come to believe in Christ, and he really believed that. But that's young Luther. Old man Luther had given up. And there was a tract written by a bunch of rabbis that was called On the Christians and Their Lies. So Luther, of course, what do you think he did? He wrote a response called On the Jews and Their Lies. And in there, he didn't say that, Jews should just be exterminated like Hitler was trying to do, but he did say, let's just get them out, get rid of their synagogues, just, and when you look at what Luther wrote about loving neighbor and loving your enemies, you just go, Luther, what were you thinking? And all Lutheran groups have repudiated this particular writing, which, by the way, was only discovered in like the beginning of 1900. Why? You look at all of Luther's writings, there's tons everywhere. His followers knew this was him at his worst, but it was authentic. It was his writing, and it's found. And then when Hitler comes around, what do you think his propaganda folks found? Oh, Luther's writing on the Jews and their lies, and they used it to, promote. If you go to the Holocaust Museum in New York, you will see a quote from Luther at the beginning of the museum. Now it's completely out of context. It's completely out, but so here's an example of Luther, why we say we don't worship Luther. He was used for an amazing purpose to reform the church, but he was a fallible, messed up human being. And so that's one, I'm not just giving you the good stuff, I'm giving you the bad stuff too. So what it says, sometimes the symbol is negative, Luther being regarded as an archetype of a broken church, unity, intolerance, and doctrinary prejudice, but more often he is regarded as a symbol of freedom. The awakening of a critical spirit willing to test established powers in light of deep conviction and a divine word. I really like that summary. I put this up here because this is a picture I took when I was in Wittenberg. I've been there twice. And what you'll see here is a tank right here. This is right after the World War II when Russia came through. And you know the history where Russia came through, east to East Germany and the west to West Germany, and then we got the wall that was built. Well, they grabbed hold of Luther and said, well, see, Luther was a communist, he was against the established order, and so, so they just grabbed onto Luther, and I put that picture there to say that people have tried to, just like all famous figures, I'll grab this person because they'll baptize our movement or whatever. And this would make Luther very sad. So this is the Castle Church, and look, there's a Russian tank pointing where? West. So when I was in Wittenberg, by the way, the tensions, and still today, the difference between East and West Germany, the unification has been fabulous and wonderful, but there's still a different culture. It's really interesting. I don't have time to talk about it. We're almost out of time. This is a beautiful by Lucas Chronic, beautiful altarpiece. And I just sense of time, I'll go to this one that's on the bottom. I think Luther would want to be known this way. Who's he pointing to? He's pointing to Jesus, who was crucified for us. He's preaching Jesus to his congregation over here. And the linen represents the resurrection. So he's telling the story of the gospel, and that's what Luther would want to be known for, and as a preacher of the word. What in the end are we to make of Martin Luther? What people think of themselves is not always an accurate measure, but Luther was remarkably frank about himself. His last written words before he died were, "We are beggars. This is the truth." So Luther was not like full of himself. He knew he was a sinner, and I think that's powerful. Luther's deep insights to the problems and potential of human freedom still echo today, clearly conveying the place of the law and God's promise in Christ to forgive sins, to raise the dead, and to bind the powers of desolation. I love that. I put this up here. Obviously, we know who the person is on the right. On the left is Martin Luther King Jr.'s dad. And his dad, last name King, had gone to Germany in the 30s and learned all about Martin Luther, and was so inspired that he came home and he changed his name, because his name was not Martin Luther. It was, I think, was it Edward? I forget his first name. And he came home and he changed his name to Martin Luther King. And he also changed his 2-year-old boy's name to Martin Luther King Jr. So I love to tell that story because, I mean, Luther has inspired a lot of people. And he's credited with Christian freedom, our ability to think, and question and wonder and ponder and, this type of thing. But ultimately, Luther would want to be known for getting us to the gospel. I think what we can do next week is I'll just touch on the theological highlights, but let me just pause, get comments, questions, thoughts.
Can I add
Please,
one thing to
please.
our opening?
Yeah.
Like Stephanie said, when she said the coming here, and it's very welcoming. I think coming to a church, your first 2 experiences are very, very important.
Yeah.
First day I came to this church, I probably had 10 couples come up, welcome. That was
Yeah.
nice.
Yeah, cool.
But the next week, and I had been going through rough few years.
Mhm.
The next week was the first day of Advent, and your sermon told me, when things get rough, look up, don't look down. And those are the exact words, and those words have stuck.
Wow.
But you did a good job.
Cool. That's great. Well, we're preaching Preaching the word, so that is, some people would say that if you wanna sum up the Lutheran movement, it's a recovery of the word. You know, as those three things we talked about in the life of the church.
So I have a
Please.
kind of a nitpicky, not nitpicky. but,
Yeah,
So I love the story about, Martin Luther marrying, but nun and priest marrying, that doesn't seem to square with the Catholic model, which is basically what he was.
right,
And so was that part of his 95 Theses, was that this isn't scriptural, that to practice your faith, you have to be married?
right. So it wasn't part of the 95 Theses, but it was part of his other writings that would come, because Luther did not find celibacy in the New Testament. And so he said, now, wait a minute. So he didn't say that a priest had to get married, but he said a priest could. And also it was a critique of what was thought of as what was holy. Because if you really wanted to be an all-in Christian, you would become a monk or a nun. Well, he said, no, you should become a parent and raise kids. And, you know, if you're a shoemaker, be a great shoemaker. And if you're a, whatever it is, so the other one part of the Lutheran movement is about justification by grace through faith. The other part is about vocation and the importance of that in our daily life. So Luther definitely, critiqued the whole celibacy thing when it came to priests. Of course, what do you think the church said about Luther? Oh, well, that's why he just wanted to get married. They told him that was what the criticism, he just wants, he can't be celibate, so that's why he started all this, and actually Luther never planned to get married, but anyway, you know how that happens, so.
Great question.
Yeah, that is a great question.
I have a couple.
Please,
Luther didn't want to establish his own church.
right.
At that time, was there even a model for that? I mean, did Roman Catholics and Eastern Orthodox or any of that split happen?
Yeah, the East and the West had been split for a good, 500 years.
That was Constantine.
That happened in about 1000 AD. 1054 is when the official split between the East and the West happened. But you could trace it all the way back to Constantine, when Constantine made Constantinople, which became Istanbul when Islam took it over. But that you could see the difference between the East and the West church, even going way back. But it finally broke apart in I think 1054 AD. So they had 500 years of. So the only part of the church Luther knew of was the Roman Catholic Church, was the West. And so there wasn't a model. I mean, that's a great question, Tom, because now how are we going to organize ourselves? So these princes that go with the Reformation, okay, how are we going to get priests? How are we going to get pastors? All of this administrative stuff had to be created. And unfortunately, the only place a lot of times Luther had to go was to go to the secular authorities. And that was kind of like, that was not ultimately a good thing. But like when the Reformation went off to Norway, for instance, since this is a Norwegian congregation in its founding, the king became Lutheran. His kingdom became. So, it went, and so for a while, and it gets very complicated. But, if the prince was reformed, your area was reformed. If it wasn't, if it was Catholic, and then you started to have all these warring things. Charles came in after Luther died and wiped out what was called the Small League, came to Luther's grave in the castle church, and the Pope wanted him to dig up Luther's grave and destroy his body, and Emperor Charles said, I only deal with living people. And he left him alone, and his grave is still there in Wittenberg. So, but yes, so that was a big problem, and it's complicated, but they had to kind of start from scratch and create a structure and organization.
And then we went pretty quickly from the 95 Theses to no more indulgences. I assume that was a very turbulent period. What were the 95 Theses printed and circulated? Is that what infected everything?
That's what went viral. Yeah. Well, some people debate whether he actually not put him up on the Wittenberg door as the legend is, although Philip Melanchthon is right-hand man, which I didn't tell you much about him. When he did Luther's eulogy at his funeral, he said Luther tacked him out there. So I think if he said that's what he did, but that's not what got him viral, so to speak. The printing press printed them and started circulating them. They didn't get his permission. All kinds of things that he wrote got printed that he didn't like. What? I didn't know this, because there was no laws, there was no thing. So they printed up what he wrote because it was so popular. So the 95 Theses went out there and got to Rome. And it was one of the writings that got him condemned as a heretic and kicked out.
Was there, I assume there's kind of an unholy alliance between whatever lords and monarchs were in a region and the Catholic Church,
Yeah,
lack of a better word, maybe kickbacks from indulgences. That whole system presumably was under stress as well, but
there was a lot of unhappiness in the part of the Holy Roman Empire that Luther was with Rome. All of our money's going to Rome. You know, there
okay,
was,
so they weren't benefiting.
they
from
were
that.
not so much benefiting locally. Now, there was probably some benefit there, but a lot of, you know, it was the frustration with it going to Rome. So, yeah. And so there was, you could say, an unholy alliance. It's really complicated. You've got the emperor, who was a devout Roman Catholic, and you got the Pope, but they didn't get along. There was one time when the emperor came in and sacked all of Rome because of what the Pope was doing. So even though they both didn't like Luther, because Luther religiously was going against the Pope, but Emperor Charles wanted peace. He wanted unity, because there's another factor that I didn't even mention tonight. So I'm glad you said that. There's something else going on that actually, if it wouldn't have been going on, Luther might not have ever happened. Certainly Frederick, who protected him, because he had control of his area. And Luther got to his whole life, he was a wanted man. If he ventured out of Prince Frederick, or Frederick dies, but his successors were there, he could have been killed anytime without any recourse. He had a death sentence on his life because he was banned, and you know, all of this. So, but there was something else going on that was keeping Emperor Charles busy. What do you think? You remember, you know, your world history, you remember at the gates of Vienna, there was the Turk. And they were threatening to overrun all of Europe. And the Emperor Charles was like, we need to deal with this. This is our big threat. He didn't have any room for a theological debate about, you know, whatever. But he couldn't just put all of his forces to taking care of this problem in Germania, you know, or in Saxony, you know. You know, that allowed the Reformation to get going, because Charles was so busy defending Europe from the Muslim Turks. Yep. Yeah. So I know we're over again.
I love this. Sorry.
I love it too. Other questions, Marissa or Jen or Ani, you guys, Tinica, you're good? Okay, yeah. I hope this is helpful. I mean, I just did a quick. Next week, I'll bring you the books in the library, or if you were here on a Sunday, or I can show you guys as we leave. There's a wonderful short biography of Luther called Luther, A Life by Jim Nestigan. I highly recommend it. I mean, I've got, you know, 3-volume stuff, you know. I mean, I if you want that too, I can get to that. But if you want to start with a small one, Martin Luther, there's a full feature movie back in the DVD years of Martin Luther, and Joseph Fiennes plays Martin Luther. My wife said he is much better looking than Martin Luther was. But anyway, that's something you can still get a hold. You can go on YouTube or whatever and find it, and it's pretty well done. So yeah, so you can watch that. There's some old black and white ones that are cool too, but those might put you to sleep. Okay, this has been fun. Thank you for listening, and I hope it helps understand our namesake. And next week I'll hit really quickly just those real some just real core Lutheran theological things. And then we will talk about baptism and the Lord's Supper. We'll talk about sacraments, because that is, now we're starting to talk about something that's, you know, there's a lot of different views of. So anyway, okay. Have a great evening. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Again, I'm not doing good with my time here, so I
Nobody's
appreciate your
complaining.
patience. Nobody's complaining. Well, bless you.
Thank you. Good night.
All right, good night,
Good
Tina.
night.
Good night.
I'll stop the share here and hang on. If there's any other.
Can I ask you a
Okay,
question about
Yes, let me-
Gene?
yes, let
Make
me
sure
just.
it's not just something I should